All right, our lesson, we're on lesson 6. It's on deceit. Before I forget, I have put lesson 7 questions on the table in the back. Lesson 7 is going to be on ingratitude, which not even kind of sort of planned, but given the fact that Thanksgiving's coming up, I think that just happened to be a little coincidental and happy accident there. So, but anyway, so lesson 6, talking about deceit. And throughout the lesson, there's several examples that Tommy brings up. Some are very good examples with regard to the danger of deceit. And of course, basically lying is just a form of deceit. Whether it's lying or misdirection or attempting to try to put off some sort of answering for my responsibilities that maybe I didn't do. Deceit, ultimately, the whole point is to try to cast off anything from myself onto someone else. And it's ultimately self-serving. That's really what the bottom line of deceit is. And Tommy brings up David, as most of these lesson writers do, because the basis of this is what David said about creating me a clean heart after his sin with Bathsheba. And Tommy points out the deceit on David's part, that after his sin with Bathsheba, what did he attempt to do? What all did he do that it was deceptive? Try to get Uriah to come back home so that he could pass that baby off as if it was Uriah's. They didn't have DNA testing back then. So I guess David was simply hoping that Bathsheba wouldn't say anything. But then that didn't work, so then what? Put him on the front lines, and what did he tell Joab? What did he tell Joab to do? To retreat and make sure that front line is kind of covering their retreat. And so was it just Uriah who died? Was he the only one who died in that? No. In fact, remember Joab made a point to tell David that Uriah is also dead, but many died. And that was part of the reason why but tell him Uriah also died. And David says, well, that's what happens. That was deceitful as well, because the whole point in that was to kill Uriah. So, define deceit.
According to the book, it's to be false or guile, feigned, fraudulent.
Yep.
Treachery,
Subtlety. Yep. Guile, fraud, treachery, trickery. And ultimately, there's really, I've worked trying to figure out a way to make it work, to see, is there a way to make, in any way, the motivation for deceit anything other than self-serving? And even if you're deceiving on behalf of somebody else, there's still some self-interest there. Like there's a reason why you're doing it, whether it's out of loyalty and you don't want to be disloyal or whatever it may be, there's still some self-governing rule or idea there that is still self-centered, even if you think you're doing it for somebody else. And the key component here is, let's say nobody gets hurt. Okay, that's kind of the common, the excuse for the little white lie. Well, it's a victimless crime. Nobody gets hurt. Little white lies are to preserve people's feelings and that sort of thing. Even if, quote unquote, nobody gets hurt, even if it is to preserve people's feelings, is it still wrong? Yes, it's falsehood. All right, and one of the things, the very first duty of the Christian is to the truth. That's to God's truth and the absolute truth of what is. Not to simply make up our own reality and pass it off as if it's real and try to preserve people's feelings or whatever it may be. No, our first job is to the truth. And that's one of the issues with deceit, is that it corrupts the Christian's first and primary focus, which is making sure that we're holding fast to the truth of what God says and what the truth of what is. Question 2, who was the first to be deceived and how did it happen? Eve was deceived. Satan lied. Okay, he said, "You shall not surely die." And and of course Satan may have, whether he meant you will not die physically necessarily, or he was flat out meant, no, you won't die ever. Regardless, he was lying, because they died spiritually, first of all, and then because they were cast out of the garden, obviously death and pain and suffering entered into the world as well. I would also suggest that while Satan lied, ultimately it was the temptation of the deceptive nature of how Eve kind of justified it in her mind. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. It's good for food, and its desire will make one wise. And so Eve kind of let her mind deceive her. So it wasn't just Satan's lie. She kind of ran with it. And Satan didn't point out all three of those things. The only thing you could argue he pointed out was that you'll be like God. So that would be, I guess, pride. But the others, Eve kind of came up on her own. So ultimately, this deceit, it's not just something that Satan does. It's something that all Satan has to do, and we mentioned this before, is just plant the question. Just kind of plant the suggestion. And then if we allow our minds to do that, they'll just run off with it. And we can deceive ourselves. Often in the New Testament, especially in Paul's epistles, there's warnings about deceiving yourself. Okay, Satan, is he at the root of all that? Sure. But in the end, we deceive ourselves when we, first of all, aren't honest with the truth, whether it's for ourselves, our own personal application in our own lives, which certainly requires reflection, or if we're honest with the gospel for others. If we try to sugarcoat it, or try to somehow not apply something, or try to omit certain things from the whole counsel of God, that's also deceitful. Okay, there are those who try to say, well, let's just baptize people, we'll teach them about the church later. Well, does somebody need to know what they're getting into before they're baptized? Absolutely they do. In fact, I know of a situation in Florida where somebody was baptized even though the preacher and the elders knew full well this individual was in a sinful marriage and didn't say a word about it. And their excuse was, well, we'll tell them about it after they've been baptized and after they've kind of got settled in. Then we'll tell them about their sinful marriage. To me, that's deceitful. What did Jesus say about choosing to follow him? What must we first do? Count the cost. We have to know. We have to be aware. And of course, the whole idea of repentance is to acknowledge whatever's wrong in my life, at least at the moment that I know it, and turn away from it. And so teaching the truth, not omitting it when somebody needs to hear it. What was David's great weakness? Question 3. Okay, lust is one. And I don't know if Tommy's going here for thinking that he could get away with deceiving people, or if that's what he was going for. But ultimately, in this moment for David, it was thinking that because he's king, he could get away with whatever he wanted to do. And ultimately, isn't that the same problem that Saul had as well? He's king. What was the very first thing that Saul did as king, for which reason God says, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you? He offered sacrifices when he had no authority to do so. Remember, Samuel said, I'll come in 7 days, and he didn't come in 7 days, so Saul said, I felt compelled to offer the sacrifices. It was for that reason. A lot of times we think about the Amalekites. No, that just simply cemented the whole thing. God just repeated what he said about offering the sacrifices. But he's king. He can do what he wants. And unfortunately, we've talked before about how absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. And even with David, a man after God's own heart, who for by and large in his life sought to please God, there were still moments where, because he was king, I think, that thought process crept into his own mind. And of course, we see that a lot with many of the other kings as well, both of Judah and of Israel, of allowing that thought process that somehow I am, at the very least, equal to God's authority, at least in practice, if not in thought. But David's great weakness, ultimately, at the very root of it, is thinking that because I'm king, I can get away with this. And he utilized his position as king to try to get away with it. And of course, he didn't. Anything through the first 3 questions? Question 4, can people really become addicted to pornography? Yeah. Okay. Anything that causes somebody, whether it's the release of chemicals in the brain or hormones, things like that, people can become addicted even from a physiological perspective, if not a psychological. Okay, there's all kinds of things that can be addictive that are harmful. And one of the points that Tommy brings out, and this certainly applies to all of addiction, but he applies it to pornography in the sense that one sin then leads to the next sin, which then snowballs into something more and more. And of course, do we see that happening with David? It started with a single moment of lust that turned into adultery, and then that turned into deceiving Uriah, which turned into murder. And so you had this snowball effect of trying then to cover it up. And so absolutely, anything addictive that either can corrupt the body, and that certainly speaks to substances, corrupt the mind, speaks to substances as well as corrupt the heart. That all focuses on things that ultimately the temptation is, oh, this will be fun, this will be enjoyable, this will make you feel good. There's the thought process. It's like Eve, it's desirable for food, it looks good for food, but in the end, what's the wages that's going to come about? The wages of sin. Death. And we don't think about that in the moment, okay? Especially, and this is true of all human beings, but even more so in certain societies, we have this kind of desire for instant gratification, right? Delayed gratification is not something that is common, especially in the newer generations. And the idea of instant gratification a lot of times has that deceitful appearance in front of it. This will make you feel good in the moment. But then later, may there only be not only physical repercussions or consequences, but certainly spiritual ones as well. Number 5, what is petting? Sorry? Lasciviousness. Specifically being handsy, touching one another, especially in areas that are sexually arousing. That's typically the idea of petting. And it can be justified in some people's minds because, well, we're not committing fornication. So as if we're just touching each other, that's okay, as long as we're not actually having sex. And yet, as Joe pointed out, what is it? If it's not fornication, okay, it's not fornication, but what is it? It's lasciviousness. Okay, the lasciviousness and lust go hand in hand. Lasciviousness is allowing or doing something that generates lust in another. And then, of course, then there's the reciprocal, which is lust, which is the desire, that sexual desire in that case. And so part of the reason why he brings that up in the lesson is talking about guys and girls who are dating and the idea that it would feel so good. And again, that instant gratification and the idea that petting is that deceitful kind of lead into what can then turn into ultimately fornication. Question 6, what is a harlot? Okay, it's interesting, the term in the Old Testament, it literally means one who seeks to commit adultery. And usually that carried with it the sense of for money, therefore a prostitute. And that's typically how we think of a harlot. But it could also be applied to simply one who was promiscuous, one who sought to sleep around, okay, not necessarily specifically for money, and so that term can carry with that idea with it as well. And he brings that up in the context of Proverbs and how often Solomon warns his sons about the sinful woman and being aware of her deceit, the deceitful nature that she has, and the words, the swelling words that she offers and tries to make it sound so good. And of course, there's both a physical element to what Solomon warns, but also a spiritual element as well regarding sin and temptation. Because the opposite of wisdom, which is what Solomon deals with in Proverbs, is what? Foolishness. And if wisdom, the knowledge of God is beginning, or fear of God is beginning of wisdom, then foolishness is the lack of fear of God. It's the lack of respect and reverence for His Word. And so you have that kind of dual application from what he warns about regarding the harlot. There's the physical, literally a harlot, and then there's also the idea of sin and temptation. Question 7. Proverbs 7 mentions the attire of a harlot. What would that be? It's important to note that with regard to Old Testament times, what you wore spoke about your state, your status in society, or what you didn't wear spoke about your status in society. The types of clothing you wore may speak to being a married woman, for instance, versus an unmarried woman. And so people, simply by looking at you, would know a lot about you in that society. And one of the things that harlots didn't wear, does anybody know what they did not wear? They did not wear a veil. In their society, women who were married wore full veils. Women who were single wore partial veils, and then, or vice versa. And then those who were harlots didn't wear a veil at all. And that's part of the reason why Paul deals with that. And that was still the state in the culture in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 regarding those women who were prophetesses. And here these fake, or the idol prophetesses of idols who were taking their veils off and having sexual relations with people seeking to worship the gods, and they were being associated with that, and that's why Paul tells them not to do that, not to take their veils off. So there were specific types of attire that was associated with specifically like being a harlot. But I think the broader lesson Tommy's pointing to is that how we dress sends a message. What we wear, and it all goes back to whether or not we're seeking to proclaim godliness. Okay, are we seeking to proclaim godliness in the message that, or with regard to the message that we send with what we wear? And that kind of speaks to, I've known of Christians who've tried to apply that it's appropriate for the occasion. So going to the beach, it's appropriate for the occasion to wear a bikini. And yet Paul defines the occasion when he writes to Timothy regarding, 1 Timothy chapter 2, regarding men and women. He defines what the occasion is, as is befitting those who proclaim righteousness or godliness. That's the occasion. Is there ever an occasion where we should not be seeking to please God? Is there ever a place where we might go where we shouldn't seek to praise and please God? No. Whether we're at the beach, we're at the grocery store, or in our own home, obviously that's a little bit different in our own home with our spouse and that sort of thing. But when we're out and about and we're sending a message to people around us, that needs to be something that we take into account. And I think that's kind of where Tommy's going with that. But it's not so much that they were scantily clad necessarily. Today, maybe that would be true, obviously. But in that time, it wasn't necessarily the case. But they did send that message by what they didn't wear in that case, in the times of Solomon. Any thoughts to question 7?
You got to be careful. I see this every now and then. Someone who went through the drive-through, you could tell they were dressed to not come inside.
Yeah.
And then they had to come inside.
Then they had to go inside.
And
yeah.
This made me laugh.
Yeah.
That they had kind of being seen.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And
we got to be prepared for that situation. You don't enter the door.
Yeah, and your boxers or
Right.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a good point. And being aware of how we're perceived by others. Not that it matters in the sense of people nitpicking and that sort of thing. Oh, your shirt is wrinkled or whatever. But in terms of how they perceive us, especially if we claim to be a Christian and they see what we wear and they're like, you claim to be a Christian, you're wearing that? I mean, there's plenty of models and swimsuit models and stuff like that claim to be Christians. In fact, there was an article a couple months ago about one who wore a cross, a necklace with a cross on it. And they were taking pictures of her, and she was wearing the cross. They asked her to take it off, and she said no. And the photographer was like, yeah, like you're a Christian. It's a little rude to say that, but you can understand why he would think that. You're dressed like this, you're taking pictures like this, and yet you claim to be a Christian. And that goes back to some people who claim to be Christians thinking it's okay to dress like that, and it's not. All right, question 8. Why would lying be so prevalent in our society? Because it's all about self-interest. Yeah, it's about self-interest. And ultimately, that's what every single one of these qualities that we've looked at so far ultimately goes back to. This is why David prayed, create in me a clean heart. Because ultimately he knew that his sin with Bathsheba and then all the sins that came after that, it was all about himself. It was self-serving. And in those moments, he didn't think about what was right before God. He thought about what was right for him, or what was good for him. And as a result, he refused to think about it. He didn't want to think about what God wanted him to do. And
Second Thessalonians 2, because people don't receive from the opposite side the love of the truth.
they don't see the love of the truth.
And instead, in John 8, verse 44, it's evident they're the children of the devil. He's the father of lies, and so they've made their choice as to who their God is.
Right.
And it's Satan. And so their character then is going to model or emulate or display what they see in their father.
Absolutely. Those who who do you serve? You don't get to not serve anyone. You're either going to serve God or you're going to serve Satan in what you do and how we conduct ourselves. 1 John chapter 3, verse 10, the children of God and the children of Satan, John says it's very clear, those who practice the truth and love the brethren, they are of God. Those who don't practice the truth and don't love the brethren, they don't. They are the children of Satan. And so the whole idea there is whether or not are we seeking to serve God or not. Question 9, is it right to cheat if the teacher doesn't care? Huh? Who does care? I tell my kids that all the time. Okay, just because nobody else is watching, who is always watching? God is. And just because we might be alone and nobody else would know, or maybe people do know, but they don't really care, if we claim to be a Christian and yet we're cheating, does that really look good upon the name Christian? No, it's dishonest.
In the long run, it's not good either.
No.
And learning.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole idea there, and again, in the end, and he brings out the idea of cheating in school and things like that, it's self-interest, ultimately. I don't want to be bothered to do the work. I'm going to have somebody else do it for me. I don't want to, get in trouble because I didn't do my work, so I'm going to lie about it and tell the teacher I overslept or I had a car problem or something like that. It all goes back to self-serving rather than simply owning our mistakes, owning the decisions that we made that were maybe bad. Maybe we couldn't help it. Maybe there was a situation that arose, but then we lie about it anyway. I've seen that happen. You had a perfectly good reason why you couldn't do it, but you lied about it anyway. Why'd you do that? I don't know. That happens sometimes, and it's just, it's almost instinct somehow to try to come up with a reason that you think other people will appreciate as opposed to the truth. And in the end, when we do that, especially if we make a pattern of it, what other problem can come into the play with regard to relationships and roles like that if we continue to lie, especially if the person knows we're not being fully truthful? What should people always be able to do with regard to Christians? We should be able to count on us, right? We should be reliable. And that all goes back to if you can't count on somebody to tell the truth, especially a Christian who, like I said, their first job is to the truth, then who can you count on in this world? Okay, we should be, and this is part of the reason why Paul to the Ephesians, therefore speak truth one to another. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. Right. Absolutely. No, absolutely right. And they're not, and in this case, some expectations may be further than what God goes with some things and that sort of thing. But the expectations of society with regard to what a Christian should be, if it's what God says, then we should absolutely uphold that. And that goes back to, and ultimately, it may not always be the case, but generally speaking, when we show a pattern of owning our mistakes, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, and I'm going to try and do better. Do people generally appreciate that and respect that? Especially in today's society where nobody's responsible for any problems that they have. Any mistakes they make, they're not the ones that were responsible. It goes back to my parents didn't raise me right, or they didn't teach me right, or my teachers did this or said this or whatever. It's never their fault because of the decisions they make. It's somebody else's fault. And yet, does God say we're going to get to blame anybody else at Judgment Day? No. So then why shouldn't we take responsibility now if at judgment, we're definitely going to have to take responsibility. Anything else? Yes, sir.
If you've been on the receiving end of someone lying to you, in my particular case is dealing with car salesmen, it causes me a headache to literally go through that process. But when you've been on the end of that, he gives the example of Jacob.
Yeah.
Serving so many years for one wife, but then he's duped and gets a different wife. When you've been on the end of that, it helps you to understand, it should help you to understand part of the issue with lying. I mean, yes, it's a sin, obviously. We got that first and foremost, but you begin to understand why it's such a hard thing, such a sinful thing, because of the effect that it has.
Yeah.
But then we read about Jesus, who there was no sin, no guile in him. He didn't deceive with the words that he spoke.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we're going to talk a little bit this morning in our lesson about walking as Jesus walked, as we're told to do in 1 John 2 and verse 6. That means to be truthful, to be upfront and honest. And that's with the truth of God's word, for one. And it's also in day-to-day life, being honest and truthful. And even if that means getting in trouble as a result, or, you know, maybe even, hopefully we didn't do something so bad we'd get fired over it, but maybe even get fired, if that's the consequence of it, then should we be willing to handle that? Yeah, if that's the consequence of it. Anything else through question 8? Or, sorry, question 9.
To Joe's story, the word come to me is unfair.
Unfair.
That, you know, we always want to be treated fairly.
Yeah.
And we recognize it when we are, and then we recognize it when we're not. And you say, well, I'll never go back there again, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And whether that's fair or not, are we fair in our response back to someone?
That's a good point.
Or should we realize that's the world we live in? You know, that's one of the things we try to teach our children. Life is not fair.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we can't.
That we can be unfair. That's right. That's a great point. It kind of goes back to Jesus, you know, what people in the world call the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? A lot of people in our society, or I would think everybody, would not want to have somebody seek to deceive them, right? But then some people turn around and are perfectly fine deceiving others. Okay, I don't want you to deceive me, but I'm going to deceive you. It's rules for thee, but not for me, right? And that goes back to that self-interest. It goes back to whether it's justified as self-preservation or trying to get a get out of jail free card type of thing, try to get out of whatever trouble you're in. Generally, deceit is used in that way, but it can be used in a lot of other ways as well. But it's all self-serving. And it speaks to an unclean heart.
It almost takes more effort
Yeah.
to be deceitful
Yeah.
and to be honest.
It takes a lot more mental work sometimes to come up and then to keep track of what all I've said or what I haven't said. I have an extended family member who is well known for being creative in how they answer certain things. And to this day, nobody actually knows how many times she's been married. No one in my family actually knows for sure, because she always tells everybody a different number. And that's just kind of one example of kind of the way. And so in a lot of ways, that individual, everything she says, you have to take with a grain of salt, because you don't know if it's accurate or not. You don't know if it's right or not. And so you hear it, you hear what they say, but I'm not going to really put a lot of faith in that. And so that's just one of those things where I'm sure everybody probably knows someone like that. And of course, there are times where you have individuals who we might insist are pathological liars. Okay, and some people can get into a habit, and I think sometimes that gets conveyed as some kind of pathology. They can't help it. No, we can help it. I do know that there's certain types of mental illnesses and things like that may contribute to things, but we can tell the truth. It's generally we don't want to, or we don't think about it. It's become so instinctive that we don't even think about telling the truth. It's automatically, what can I come up with that'll make this sound good? And it's not just being honest with it. Question 10, why is gambling so popular? What's the gambler's fallacy? Anybody heard of that before, the gambler's fallacy? Huh?
It's not hurting anybody.
It's not hurting anybody. And there's another gambler's fallacy that says, I'm due. Okay, after you gamble so much, okay, I've lost this much, the law of statistics or probabilities or whatever says I'm due. And so the next roll, I'm due, I'm past due now, and it keeps going and going and going. And the whole idea of it is get rich quick. Okay, that's the whole idea. Get rich or get money, okay, not so rich, but get money without doing anything, without working, okay, without having to put forth the effort and earn it. Gambling, anybody who gambles and wins, have they earned it? Do they, quote unquote, deserve it? No. No, not a single person. I don't care how many studies you do or how much practice you do in card games or rolling dice or anything like that. That's not earning it. Not the way God defines earning our living, earning our wages. And so that's one other example that Tommy brings up, is the idea of gambling and how it can be so deceitful, especially with regard to, I know at least in South Carolina, I don't know if every state does it this way, but their state lottery, the way it's always advertised is about helping the children. Because their state lottery goes to, quote unquote, fund the schools in South Carolina. How much of the money actually goes to fund the schools? I don't know. I don't even know if they know. But that's how they advertise it, is go help the kids. Well, if I want to contribute to the school system, what should I do? Just write a check and go take it to wherever I need to take it to contribute to the school system. Okay? Am I even kind of sort of likely to ever win a lottery? No. Absolutely not. And so to think over and over again, and that's that gambler's fallacy coming back. Well, at this point, I've gone 30 years. At some point, I'm going to win. Statistically speaking, no, you're not. No, you're not. And it's so sad that people, they even take out loans against their upcoming paychecks to buy lottery tickets. And it just goes back to that desire to get rich, or in this case, it is get rich. I mean, some of these, I forget what state it is, that it's like at a record level or something like that now, because nobody ever wins. Hundreds and thousands of people buy these tickets and then nobody wins, so it goes up again, which I find very convenient. You're more likely to be struck by lightning. Yeah. And so that gambling, and there's a lot of different ways too that it's introduced as well in even young people's lives, where that sense of fulfillment or that sense of satisfaction, kind of a temporary one, gets fulfilled in video games and things like that, and then it kind of then shifts to real life. And so you have to be very careful with things like that. Anything else there, number 10? Yes, sir.
Just to put a verse with that, in Matthew 13:22, Jesus in the parable of the sower talks about the deceitfulness of riches.
The deceitfulness of riches.
And so it's then what can I do to get those riches? It doesn't matter how I go about attaining them. I want the riches.
Right.
So just in and of itself, the riches part has a deceitfulness to it. It's not necessarily wrong, but it certainly has a deceitful nature to it that can lead you astray so quickly.
And the sad irony to that, how many times have we heard the basic story of somebody winning the lottery and then everything in their life falls apart? I mean, friends come out of the woodwork, people, oh, I love you, oh, you're my long-lost relative, whatever, come out of the woodwork, you spend money on this and that, and the next thing you know, you're broke. The people who claim to love you and care about you, they're gone, and now you have a life full of debt. And a lot of times that's kind of what happens, especially if they're unwise, because maybe they haven't been trained in life to handle money properly, which might be why they're spending all their money on gambling and on lottery tickets, because they don't know how to spend their money properly. All right, anything else to question 10? Yes, ma'am.
I think these days, and maybe always, gambling could also be applied to not just money things, but gambling with deceitful things where you're going to not get found out.
Absolutely, yeah. In a way, that's kind of mental gambling or something like that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Maybe this will pay off at some point. This has got to pay off, right? All right. So I did want to address one particular point in the lesson And it's where he's talking about these young women getting pregnant out of wedlock and so forth, and deceitfulness of and the temptation of sin and pleasure and that sort of thing. But he uses the term, he says, do people not remember that God calls these children bastards? And I want to talk about that for a second, because I get where Tommy's going with that. The term itself, especially in the King James, is primarily in the King James and American Standard. You find it in the Old Testament twice. That's Deuteronomy 23 and Zechariah chapter 9. But that term in the Old Testament is specific to a half Jew, half Gentile. It wasn't a child born out of wedlock. It was a half Jew, half Gentile. And that's the term that the King James American Standard uses that term bastard there, but it's really more so like a hybrid, I guess you could say, or half and half Jew, half Gentile. Like Timothy would be considered that under the Old Testament. That's what Timothy would have been considered. The term does occur in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 8 in the New Testament, and I assume that's what Tommy's referring to. But the newer translations properly have illegitimate. And that does mean a child that is born out of wedlock. Okay, and that simply means that therefore the rights under the law are not accorded to them as would be had they been married, because marriage had a major civil binding nature with regard to property and things like that. And so that child is illegitimate with regard to the law and genealogy, for that matter. There's a reason why Abraham and Sarah only had, or Abraham is considered to have had only one son. Well, technically, did he only have one son? No, he had two. What was the name of the other one? And in fact, who was the firstborn? Ishmael. But because he was illegitimate, okay, therefore he was not part of that. And so Isaac was. But I also want to mention the fact that, Tommy points out he's not sure why people don't use that term anymore. And I would like to suggest, though, that the term bastard in today's society carries with it a derogatory idea. And so I appreciate the newer translations using the term illegitimate, because that better defines what that means. It's not meant to be used as a derogatory idea. It's acknowledging the state of this individual. Now, that's not a judgment on the person. It's simply describing their status in society, again, in that society. Okay, in today's society, it generally doesn't make any difference, really. But in their society, especially one that was dependent upon genealogies and law binding for properties and things like that, illegitimate was accurate to say. But that's the one thing about what Tommy said. I would be careful with that term. Bastard has a very negative connotation, derogatory. It's more so an insult to the individual, and that's not how the Bible uses it at all. It's simply describing their status in society. It has nothing to do with their character, has nothing to do with them being an evil person or a bad person or something like that. Typically in our society, that's how that term is used. That's why instead of those who are damned, we have in the newer translations those who are condemned. Okay, in the Bible, the term damnation means condemnation. But because that term has taken on a whole new meaning in today's society, we've replaced it with condemn. And I think that's appropriate to do so. Any thoughts through that?
Isn't that kind of what he's saying on 29, that more accurately is a reflection on the misdeed of the parent.
Of the parents,
not
absolutely.
The child.
Yeah.
So I think he's kind of making that point there, but we're dumbing down the fact that sin was committed.
Right.
And that's going on even within the church, that will have showers for couples that aren't even couples or weren't couples.
Right.
When the child was conceived. And I mean, and not to say that the child doesn't have needs, that's not the
Right.
point, but we're dumbing down sin just as a society in general.
Yeah.
And this is just another example.
Absolutely. Or not acknowledging it all. Yeah, not acknowledging sin at all. And that's a very dangerous, especially for a congregation of God's people, for God's people in general, to not acknowledge if sin's committed. I mean, if they've repented and that sort of thing, that's one thing. But to continue in that state, these two people living together, we're just going to pretend like it's all okay. That's not okay. Not for God's people to do that. All right. A couple of points that he brought up that I'll point out real quick. He says, I've never known an alcoholic who thought with the first drink he was heading for such a miserable life. The beer ads talk about the refreshing taste. Those ads show beautiful people having a grand time, much fun. Those ads are nothing but deceit. And I think you could apply that, and I think Tommy's whole point here is that you could apply that to pretty much any advertisement. In a lot of ways, ads in general are meant to be a little bit deceptive, okay, to make you feel like this if you drink this or if you eat that. Or if you buy this, you'll look, if you, what is that, Pantene Pro V, the shampoo, and you've got this beautiful hair on these girls and stuff like that. Oh, my hair will look like that if I use that shampoo. Probably not, but it's the whole idea of this idealized thought process. And of course, a whole idealized idea itself is deceptive. He goes on to say the person who becomes addicted to pornography doesn't do it with the first dirty picture he sees. When we read about these addicts, they begin with one picture and the habit forms and grows into an addiction. And that's true of all addiction, generally speaking, that it starts with just one moment or one time, and then it kind of snowballs after that. And unless we stop it at the very beginning, then it's going to grow into something that can't be controlled as well or as easily. And then he says, I have never known a young lady who began making out thinking I'm going to get pregnant and have a child out of wedlock. The deceptive nature of the activity, the desire to explore, the excitement of the moment, all of these lead her further than she intended to go. And Tommy's whole point there, I think, goes hand in hand. It goes vice versa as well. That can apply both to men and to women. Men can't get pregnant, but the idea of going further than they should and allowing lust or the excitement of the moment to lead one further than they ought to go, as is befitting one who seeks to proclaim godliness. He says, lying seems like the easy way to get out of a tight spot. Lying is deceit, and when one lie is told, it usually takes other lies to cover up the first one. With a great example of that is, of course, David. We see how that deceit kind of built on itself. He says the gambler doesn't become addicted with the first game of chance, the first football pool he enters, or the first lottery ticket that he purchases. But what he goes on to say about that, he says the lure of gambling begins early, as many grade schools have their carnivals with their raffles, cakewalks, and assorted other gambling games. And, you know, that's kind of a small-scale example, is raffles and things like that. Listen, if my kid's band is doing a fundraiser, if they need money, what can I do if I'm willing and able to help? Just give them the money, okay? I don't need a ticket to win a TV, all right? I'll just give you the money. I'm not doing it, and then it goes back to intent as well. I'm not doing it to try to win a car or to win a free membership at the golf course or something like that. If I'm going to help, I'm going to help because I want to, not because I'm seeking something in return. And that goes back to generosity, right? That goes back to the desire to help. It should not be about what can I get out of it, or not stopping first and think, now how can I use this later? How can I use this as leverage against them later? It's I'm going to help, and then that's it. Okay, this isn't about trying to deceive someone into then owing me something later on. And then he mentions Romans 3 verse 13, talks about those who with their tongues they've used deceit. And then he mentions Colossians 2 verse 8, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. And that goes back to the point that as much deceit as we see in this world, and as many times we see deceit might apply in our individual physical lives, it absolutely is at its most dangerous when it comes to God's word. Because hopefully we can pick out when deceit is happening in somebody's life. Okay, if you're not telling the truth, if you're trying to cheat or whatever. But when you start deceiving, especially ourselves with God's word, that speaks to the root of truth. And if I'm now convincing myself of something that is not true, now I'm then patterning my life after something that is baseless. It has no foundation. And so that's part of the reason why you have these constant calls for not to deceive ourselves. But Paul warns us in 2 Timothy chapter 3, he says things are going to get worse and worse. People deceiving and being deceived. And that's the nature of man to do that. Perfect. All right, that's the lesson for you this morning. Next lesson, like I said, lesson 7 is on ingratitude. That'll be next Sunday. Thank you, everybody.